All right, hi everyone, can you all hear me? Awesome. Okay, so our group is looking at the effects of auditory cues on the variability in handwriting. Some of our group members weren't able to make it, but we're still going to present our group's data. So go ahead. So we looked at previous research to develop kind of what we wanted to study. And we found that auditory cues were found to reduce variability in fine motor tasks, specifically finger tapping. And then other research showed that different styles of the auditory cues, like an activating type of music, was seen to increase walking speed. Next, we found that verbal auditory cues were shown to benefit writing for people with Parkinson's disease by lowering the variability in cycle time and total amplitude. But we did find a gap, and there was limited research examining the relationship between auditory cues like music and handwriting specifically. So our purpose of the study was to determine how auditory cues affect variability for a fine motor task such as handwriting. And we looked and hypothesized that the presence of auditory cues would decrease the amount of variability for handwriting compared to writing with no cues at all. So our study, we did collect 10 people, but due to not being on campus and kind of limited time, we have 6 analyzed at this time, and we plan to analyze more when we get the chance.
So for the experimental setup, participants used a just regular ballpoint pen with an electromagnetic sensor attached to the tip. The position collecting sensor was put right in front of the paper with one little heart on it. And the software motion monitor was used to measure the electromagnetic sensor activity. So this is just where we place the sensors. So we put one on the FDI on the hand and then up on the EDC on the arm. So for the actual data collection, participants were asked to write continuous lowercase cursive L's on 1.5 centimeter lined paper. They were each given a practice trial before each new condition, and they were randomly assigned the order of one of 4 conditions, including the no music control, metronome, activating music, and relaxing music. And each condition was completed 3 times for a total of 12 trials. So each participant's self-pace was calculated during their first controlled trial, and we used that pace in the subsequent conditions. We used pitch switch to change the pace of each auditory cue to the own person's self-paced handwriting. Each condition was 10 seconds, and then they began listening to the auditory cue 5 seconds before the writing task began. So for the outcome measures, for the kinematic data, we looked at the average and coefficient of variation for time between letters, peak acceleration, and letter height. And then for the EMG, we looked at the average and coefficient of variation for area under the curve for the EDC and for the FDI. And the coefficient of variation basically just lets us see how the consistency changes between each of the conditions.
So I'm going to go over what we've found in our results. So just to give a brief kind of idea on how everyone separated it within our group. We have a pretty big group. So we did do weighted pen, but today we're just going to go over what normal pen looks like for kinematics and for EMG. That data is still being worked on, and some of the members that presented it aren't here today. So we're just going to cover normal pen. So first of all, we have our kinematic data. This first graph, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, this first graph right here, this shows our average coefficient of variation for letter height versus each condition. As Jamie talked about earlier, we have control, metronome, activating, and relaxing for each of these graphs shown too. Our p-value ended up being 0.421, which does not show any significance, unfortunately, but it was interesting to see how it turned out. So over here, then we do have coefficient of variation of time, which our p-value ended up being 0.07. So we were pretty excited about that because that is close to being significant. We hope that with more participants in future, like looking into it and getting everyone analyzed, then we'll be able to hopefully show some more significance, but that was pretty exciting to see. And then our third graph down here, we looked at peak acceleration versus each condition. The error bars are shown in black, and yeah, good stuff. Next we have EMG. So like Jamie talked about earlier, it's the area under the curve versus all of the conditions. On the left we have our EDC, and on the right we have the FDI. These p-values are below. Not the prettiest numbers in the world, but still pretty interesting to know. I'm going to go back really quick here. So what we found with this was that there's significance across all conditions, specifically the metronome and activating music, which supports our first hypothesis. We did have a small sample size with limited diversity. However, the trends offer insight for further research, and further directions include us collecting on more participants and healthy older adults. Like I said earlier, we only got to completely analyze 6 participants out of the 10 that we had collected on, and then we're hoping for finding more people to collect on, as well as more data to analyze. So here are our citations, and we'll open it up for questions. Any questions or comments?
I have a question for you. Anyone who wants to answer it, maybe just personally, what was your biggest takeaway from this project?
I think it was interesting because when we chose this project, like obviously we knew that handwriting was affected, but I think we kind of were able to see like how impactful handwriting can be. Like we don't think about how much we use handwriting even just to like communicate, like writing birthday cards and like little things like that. We don't think about how impactful those things can be. So I think it was interesting to see like how negatively those things can be affected, and it might seem like a small thing when you look at a large range of symptoms, but it has like a very high effectiveness level as far as like your normal life.
Yeah, I also thought that it was interesting to see some people reacted like very differently to like weighted pen. For some people it helped a lot, and then we also heard participants tell us that they liked using the metronome. So it was interesting to see how what we hypothesized, if that matched up with people's actual interpretation of it. So that was cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of excited to look more into everything, because we do have a lot of data to go through, especially between all of the conditions and then normal pen versus weighted pen. But I think it'll definitely be worth it in the end to see like if we do find any significance between time and everything, acceleration.
Just wanted to say congratulations, you guys, because I remember when we had first started this project, and you guys really, it was a huge learning curve, and you guys really pushed through it, and congratulations
Thank you.
to get this far. You guys worked really hard. So
Thank you.
of course. If there's not any other questions, we can go to the next speaker. Triu said he's clapping, which is good. Yes, we can all just clap. Yes, there we go. We're clapping loud here. All right. Next group, go ahead and start sharing. Well done, guys.
I think I'm up next. Let's see. Can everyone see that okay? Maybe a thumbs up. All right, awesome. My name's Cailie Logue. I'm a junior in the lab this semester. And I'd actually never personally been to a singing outreach group before I started this project. But since the switch to this virtual online, I know there's been some major downsides of it, but one of the positives of this for me has been I've actually been able to go to virtual singing a few times, and I've really enjoyed that. So it kind of gives me a perspective with what my research was really about. So my research was about the effects of singing outreach groups on the motor and non-motor aspects of daily living. Oops. There we As many of you know, Parkinson's disease is a degenerative nervous system disorder, and it can affect many aspects of a person's daily living, everything from non-motor symptoms, which include sleep or cognitive functioning, to motor symptoms like handwriting, like just discussed, or using a fork, buttoning your coat, all of those things. And so the Movement Disorder Society, using the UPDRS, or Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, has made a systematic way for us to score the progression of these symptoms. And so there's a bigger part of this scale, but today we're just going to focus on the motor and non-motor symptoms, and we want to see how singing outreach affects these symptoms. Dr. Stegmuller actually has done previous research on how singing therapies affect voice and swallow in people with Parkinson's disease, and she showed that they improve those as well as an improved quality of life. So I just wanted to research how singing outreach could specifically affect just those motor and non-motor total UPDRS scores of daily living. So the purpose of this study was to research how singing therapy could affect persons with Parkinson's disease motor and non-motor aspects of daily living. And I hypothesized, based on Dr. S's findings, that the participants of the singing group would have a lower total MDS UPDRS scores than those who did not participate in singing. And a lower score would indicate a lesser progression of those symptoms. So this study was just a one-time study. It was held down at the First Baptist Church in Ames, where they have singing. And there was a control and an experimental group. So in the experimental group were the 19 participants who attended a 1-hour singing outreach session. And in the non-singing group were 9 participants who didn't go to the singing outreach session. They just kind of hung out there at that same location for the same amount of time. And then after this hour, both groups were given the questions on that MDS UPDRS scale verbally by Dr. Stegmuller, and their responses were recorded for data analysis later. So this is just an example of what scoring might look like on the MDS UPDRS scale. As I mentioned before, it's split into non-motor and motor symptoms. And so this is an example of a non-motor symptom, and I just wanted to show you how I would have scored this data going through it. So Dr. S, in the questioning, would have read this question here at the top. Over the past week, have you had any trouble going to sleep at night or staying asleep? And someone might respond like, oh, I haven't been able to sleep more than like 4 hours a night. That would be kind of a severe case. You're not asleep for most of the night. Whereas if you say I get 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night, that would be more normal. And most people lie somewhere in the middle. It's just easier to show how it would be scored with those extremes. So as the data analysis was carried out, all verbal responses were scored. And then afterwards, I took the average scores of the singing group and the non-singing group and compared them using a t-test to see if there was a significant difference between the two groups. While I was analyzing this data, I didn't know which participants were in the control or experimental group to eliminate any bias that I could have. And these were the results that we found. The results actually were kind of shocking based on what we knew about from previous research. The non-singing group actually had a lower total score than the singing group in both cases. And they had been doing they had had Parkinson's disease for about the same amount of time. Both groups had it for about 8 years. And so this is just the same results displayed graphically, showing that there was a significant difference with the non-sing group having a lower score for the non-motor aspects with the p-value of 0.01, and for the motor aspects with the p-value less than 0.05. So after seeing that this data did not support my hypothesis and was very different from what we expected to see, we kind of started to think of reasons why this may be. We concluded that an individual with a further progression of their motor and non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease may be more likely to attend outreach groups like singing, or additionally that people in the singing group may have been more comfortable with Dr. Stegmuller, as most people in the singing group had gone to singing for maybe up to 2 years before this study was done. And so they may have been more comfortable sharing about the progression of some of those symptoms than those in the non-singing group, as those were people who didn't have a previous relationship with Dr. Stegmuller from attending singing groups previously. Some limitations of this study are that everyone who responds, their responses are subjective. So they may be worse or better than what the person self-reports. For example, I noticed that everyone, regardless of what their handwriting actually looked like, as soon as the question was asked, most people would say, my handwriting is horrible. It's just something a lot of people generally think. And so that may be more severe than what their actual handwriting is like. Also, I did compare these results with the average number of years that the people had Parkinson's disease, but this doesn't necessarily represent the progression of their symptoms. So going forward, I'd like to compare my results with the Hoehn and Yahr scores to see how those compare with the UPDRS score I found. Also, other extraneous factors could have played into effect. For example, if someone in the non-sing group attended physical therapy regularly, this could help improve their motor score and therefore affect the data. So all in all, although my hypothesis was not supported, and this is not really consistent with what previous research has found, we could say that individuals with the further progression of the motor and non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease may be more likely to attend outreach groups for factors other than its effects on the non-motor and motor aspects of daily living. So personally, after attending outreach groups, I've seen a lot of personal connections built between people who participate and the students there, and I haven't done any research on that, but I know Dr. S and some of the other people in the lab have kind of started to look at quality of life and things like that, and seen that it can really be improved by these outreach groups. So all this information has important implications in continuing the development of therapies for individuals with Parkinson's disease. Do you have any questions?
I have a question. So you said that you're a junior, right? So are you going to be in the lab next year? Are you going to continue with this, or do you think you're going to veer one way or the other?
That's a good question. This is actually part of a larger study that Dr. S is doing for a Grammy grant. And I'm also a student athlete, so I don't keep up the same amount of lab hours that it would require to carry out my own research project. So I usually only enroll in one semester in the year and kind of work on it all year long. So I haven't ever really, I kind of just like do odd jobs that Dr. S has for me. And this was a way for me to like learn about analyzing data and processing my own data. So I'm kind of behind where a regular junior would be in the lab. So I haven't really come up with any ways to further this study, but I think I did like, after going to singing outreach groups, I think it would be interesting to continue focusing my research within singing and its effects. Good question, thank you.
Cailie, awesome job. It's been fun having you in singing group. It really does make it all better. So with that, I think we can move to our last speaker, or last group, whenever we're ready.
Okay, 1 minute. Stop sharing for a sec here. There we go. Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Cool.
All right, so we are the first years and we did our project on the effects of auditory stimulation on complex walking tasks. So research has found that rhythmic auditory stimulation can help improve a person's gait, as it has been seen to activate motor neurons similarly to the way that auditory stimuli triggered the startle reflex. External music, like just hearing music in the background or having headphones in, or rhythmic beats have been used in therapy and have been shown to improve a person's gait, specifically on ground walking gait. This is not preferable on an everyday basis, though, as someone might have to lug around headphones or CD player or whatever. So our study analyzed young adults, and we wanted to look at how the auditory stimulation would affect a person's cadence, time of completion, and accuracy throughout their complex walking tasks, And the complex walking task that we looked at was tandem walking. We also noted that there were a few studies that actually looked at young adults and how it affected them. There were more research on how it affected persons with Parkinson's or older adults. Our research question is, what are the effects of self-performed auditory cues on complex walking? So why we chose to do this study, we wanted to look at, again, how the effects of auditory stimulation affected a complex walk or a dual task walking. And this reason is because with older adults and people with Parkinson's, they can also suffer from complications with their gait, and this can lead to increased risk of falling and stumbling when walking around. We also included an experimental group who had their eyes closed because we saw in our research that visual cues can also play a role on a person's gait, so we wanted to eliminate visual cues. Our hypothesis was self-produced auditory cues would increase the accuracy of a person's gait by decreasing time and missteps.
So for this experiment, we had 3 groups. Our control, which was tandem walking with no auditory cues and our eyes open. The 2 experimental groups. The first one was tandem walking with auditory cues, eyes open, and the second one was tandem walking, auditory cues, eyes closed. And we chose the song Row, Row, Row Your Boat because that's kind of an easier song to remember and it has a consistent beat. And then the picture on the bottom kind of shows what tandem walking is. It's basically just heel to toe walking. And then for this experiment, we measured out 3 meters of tape, 1-inch painter's tape we used, and we placed it on a hard surface. We either used tile or concrete. The reason we did tile and concrete was because carpet was kind of easy to tell the difference between the tape and the carpet, and we wanted our participants to be barefoot during this. Then we documented each individual shoe size to be more accurate with missteps. A misstep is when the participant steps completely off of the tape, their whole foot steps off of the tape. And then the trial conditions that were determined, we used a randomization software which picked out which ones to go in which order. And the participants were then instructed to be barefoot, like I said before, to eliminate shoe heels. So we used a timer and we timed how long it took the participant to walk from the beginning of the tape to the end of the tape. And then during that time, we counted the missteps and we counted the cadence, which was just counting each footstep and then multiplying that by 4. And then between each trial, we allotted the participants 3 minutes to rest. And we repeated all of the 3 trials for each condition until they were all recorded.
I think you're muted still, Sarah.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just talking to myself there. Okay, so looking at the data we had 3 dependent variables in the study, which is what we measured, being time, cadence, and accuracy. However, for the study, due to Corona, among many other issues and things that came up, we're only going to be analyzing time in this presentation. However, in the future, we'd like to analyze cadence and accuracy. So like Elizabeth said, we had 3 trials for each condition, and then the average was used to statistically analyze the data. And the specific test that we used was a repetitive measure ANOVA with 3 conditions. Looking at the demographics, we had 5 participants total, with 60% of them being females, making up 3, and 40% of them being males, making up 2. And the average age of our participants was 22.6, which is rounded up to 23 years old. And then we had a range of participants from 19 years old to 30 years old. So this is just kind of a visual representation of the data that we collected. And basically the p-value, if it was greater than 0.05, which it was, then there was no statistical difference between each of the conditions, meaning there was no difference in time with the eyes open in auditory cues, eyes open with no auditory cues, and the eyes open or eyes closed with auditory cues. Just kind of summarizing this data, this does not support our hypothesis of decreased time with auditory cues added to each of the conditions. However, improved accuracy and cadence are still under review and could show improvements. Possible explanations for the data not supporting our hypothesis could be limited participants, because we only had 5, and we all had different environments and experimenters, as the data was collected once the universities had already closed down, and we all kind of collected the data in our homes. So there's a lot of variabilities.
So as Sarah started to explain, our experiment in general just had a lot of limitations because of the COVID-19 situation and all of us being quarantined in our own homes. So with that, we're all using different setups that were very inconsistent because we had different spaces and different flooring and surfaces that we were trying to do the experiment on. We also had some different tape because we were trying to use resources that we already had and not making people go out given the situation. And then we also had a lot of different sizes of feet, which in our original ideas for our experiment, we were going to kind of adapt for different size feet to be able to say, like, this is more accurate on each person's foot size if someone had a wider foot. But with the modified experiment, we only had one strip of tape. So different sizes of feet, if you had a bigger foot, it was much easier to step off of the tape and it be counted as a misstep. We also had a little bit of inconsistent footwear because directions were a little bit different and not everyone was barefoot. We also had, as Sarah said, a very, very small sample size because we had to use people that were in our own homes that were in the young adult age range that we wanted to use. So we had very limited options of people to test on. And then, so because each of us were giving our directions to our participants, we didn't really have a way to create a consistent direction set for each of our participants. And with that, we were also all judging the accuracy of our participants individually. So the accuracy judgment was kind of inconsistent. So in conclusion, we did this experiment to try to explore the effects of internally produced music on a complex gait task because we had found that externally produced music was extensively researched with gait, but internally had only really been researched with ground walking and not a complex task as much. And we know that elderly people and people with Parkinson's often have gait complications, so this could eventually be used to help them if we can find some statistical significance in the future. Our hypothesis, again, was self-produced auditory cues will improve gait by lowering times and increasing accuracy. And our hypothesis, although being unsupported by the data we collected, we do have to take into consideration the limitations given the coronavirus situation definitely limited our data and make us very inclined to potentially have the opportunity to retake our data when we're in more of a controlled environment in the lab. So for future directions, we would like to collect more accurate data to hopefully see that there is some statistical significance in the future. And we would also potentially like to continue research with different age groups so we can try to apply this concept to people with Parkinson's to hopefully help their gait complications that they have. We've also talked about potentially incorporating this complex walking study with biomechanics researchers because we could use pressure plates to kind of get like specific gait complications and like what specifically is affected by having those auditory cues, such as like balance and how people's how they place the weight on their feet. And we could also use motion sensors to find out exactly how someone's body is executing the gait task and how the auditory cues could affect that. We'd also like to potentially further explore the visual cue idea that we had and potentially see how other senses can affect gait besides just the visual. So first of all, for our acknowledgements, we'd like to give a big thank you to Dr. Stegemuller and for our mentors who helped us, being first years, kind of figure out the ropes of the lab and try to get some stuff figured out with the whole situation of not being able to be on campus. And we'd also like to give a thank you to the lab and the outreach groups for just really supporting us and allowing us to be a part of this really great community. Do you have any questions for us?